The Fable Archive, Record 9, Case File, Skin Deep Primary Subject, The Princess, Designation fluctuates, Subject appears rewritten across drafts, Secondary Subject, The Frog Prince, Entity alternates between Curse Bearer and Curse Origin, Status, Skin samples do not match any single creature, Layers appear to shed between readings, Archivist, Warning, Record shows symptoms of identity bleed, Document may attempt to mimic reader, Welcome to Twilight Fables. A chill settles over this record before its ink is even dry, as though the parchment itself resists the telling. Threads from earlier cases flicker at the edges, thorn-etched margins that were not present when the archivist set down the page, faint impressions of slipper-shaped sigils that seem to fade when stared at directly, and the subtle rustling of unseen branches like the whispering trees of the weeping wood, though no forest stands anywhere nearby. Identity drift, the archivists say, is most common in tales of transformation, especially those involving mirrors, reflections, or creatures that wear more than one skin. And this tale, more than most, is a tangle of skins. It begins with a princess who may or may not have been the true heir of her land, though records contradict themselves on her lineage. Some drafts name her Aurelia, others Adeline, others simply She Who Seeks. For clarity, she will be referred to only as the princess, though this may not hold. Already the ink ripples, suggesting it may attempt another name later. Her kingdom, like so many catalogued in the archive, existed in a state of fading grandeur, a palace built on lake water, and long-forgotten promises. The water beneath it had grown murky over generations, dense with silt and shadows, and the courtiers whispered that something ancient stirred in its depths, though none dared to say it aloud. The princess was not one beloved by her people, not entirely. Though graceful, soft-spoken, and dutiful, she often drifted away from courtly expectations. She sought solitude, spent hours near the lake rather than at dances, and avoided mirrors whenever possible. Some claimed she feared what she might see in them. Others believed she saw too much. There had always been rumors, hints of a strangeness in her lineage, a shifting nature in her gaze, as though her eyes momentarily belonged to someone else. The archivists note that in several cross-referenced records, she appears in the margins of unrelated tales. A girl standing behind the crowd in the 13th slipper, her outline smudged but unmistakable. A reflected silhouette in the thorn-covered windows of the beast's castle from the Garden of Thorns, even though no princess was recorded as visiting. A pale glimmer between the trunks of the weeping wood that dissolved when approached. Whether these were true appearances or symptoms of identity bleed, the archive cannot agree. Still, all sources align on one detail. One evening, shortly before the kingdom's Festival of Lanterns, the princess lost something of great importance, something she refused to name. Some accounts claim it was a golden ball, a childhood toy she kept close as a charm of gentler days. Others imply it was not an object at all, but a secret, a promise, or even a fragment of her identity that slipped free from her grasp and fell into the lake's depths. Regardless of interpretation, the event left her shaken. The lake seemed to swallow whatever she dropped with unnatural eagerness, rippling in a slow spiral, as though drawing breath. The princess knelt at the water's edge, reaching toward the dark surface, though she knew it was already too late. She whispered something then, witnesses differ on what, and the reeds nearby rustled in response. The air thickened, carrying the scent of damp stone and old stories. Then came the voice. "Do not grieve," it croaked, low and oddly melodic. "What is lost may yet be retrieved." From the black water emerged a shape that glistened in the last threads of sunset. A frog, though larger than any natural creature, with skin that shimmered in strange, layered patterns. Scales folding into smoothness, smoothness rippling into something like fur, then dissolving back into wet, amphibious flesh. Its eyes held too much awareness, too much intent. When it blinked, the princess felt the faintest tremor in her skull, as though another heartbeat pulsed behind her own. She recoiled at first, but the creature only inclined its head, watching her with quiet patience. "You seek something," it said. Not asked. Said. The princess hesitated. Whatever she had lost, she could not speak it aloud. The archivists note several drafts where her silence takes different shapes. In some, she fears the frog will demand too steep a price. In others, she does not know the name of what she dropped, only the ache of its absence. And in one chilling variant, she cannot speak because the missing thing was her voice. But after a long moment, she nodded. The frog slipped beneath the water, leaving only widening ripples behind. The princess waited. Dusk deepened. The first lanterns lit across the palace causeways, casting wavering glows across the lake's surface. Then the water stirred again, and the frog resurfaced, bearing a small object in its mouth. What that object was changes with each version: golden ball, locket, folded letter, fragment of bone, piece of broken mirror. But the princess reacted the same way in all accounts. Relief, recognition, an almost painful sense of rightness, as though something in her had clicked back into place. She reached for the object, but the frog pulled it back slightly. "A promise," it said softly. "Your treasure for a promise." The princess stiffened. Courtly stories warned of bargains with creatures of the deep, beings shaped by magic older than kingdoms, older than language. But she was desperate, and all debts in her life already felt predetermined. She whispered, "What do you ask?" The frog lifted its strange eyes to hers. "Let me stay by your side," it said. "Only until your heart is whole. Then I shall return to the depths." A simple request, or so it seemed. Witnesses, those few who later confessed to watching from behind the reeds, claimed the air tightened around the princess then, as though the world held its breath. A flicker of thorn-shaped shadows crawled along the water's surface, though no thorns grew nearby. A faint, echoing note like distant dancing slippers floated across the lake, dissolving as quickly as it came. And something in the princess's posture shifted, as though she recognized the frog, not as a stranger, but as something she had encountered before in another draft of her life. She accepted the bargain. The frog set the recovered item in her palm with surprising gentleness. The moment she touched it, the lake shuddered, sending a shockwave across the surface. The lantern's reflections broke into jagged lines, bending and twisting like limbs. A chill rippled through the air. The creature followed her back to the palace. No guard dared question the princess. Her face held an unreadable expression, calm but distant, as though part of her hovered slightly behind her body. The frog hopped beside her, its wet skin glistening with shifting textures that made some servants avert their eyes. As she crossed the threshold into her private chambers, a whisper brushed the back of her mind. This is how it begins. Whether the thought came from herself or from the frog, she could not tell. Over the next days, the palace changed, not openly, not dramatically, but with the subtle wrongness the archive often records in cursed or rewritten spaces. Mirrors fogged at her approach, even when the air was dry. Tapestries seemed to shift the patterns of their threads when she walked past. Courtiers looked at her too long, then looked away too quickly. The frog stayed at her side, speaking little, observing everything. At night, she felt its presence near her bed, breathing slow and soft, though its shape sometimes seemed larger in the dark. Its silhouette stretched, limbs not quite where they should be. She dreamed of lakes with endless depths, of reflections that climbed out of the water and stood beside her. She dreamed of shedding her skin like a gown, layer by layer, until she no longer knew which form belonged to her. On the third night, she awoke to the frog whispering her name, one of the forgotten ones, a name she had not spoken since childhood, and in some versions not at all. She froze. "How do you know that name?" she whispered. The frog gazed at her with unreadable eyes. "Because," it said, "you told it to me once." A chill crawled up her spine. "When?" The creature hesitated. "Another draft," it murmured. "Another telling, another you." The princess pressed a hand to her chest. Something pulsed beneath her skin, something that felt like memory, like recognition, like fear. "What are you?" she whispered. The frog did not answer. Instead, it leapt onto her bed and placed a small, cold hand, too shaped, too almost human, against her wrist. "You promised," it said gently, "and promises bind." The princess wanted to pull away. She did not. As the moonlight rippled across the floor, her reflection in the window pane stretched into a second shape beside her, taller, thinner, crowned with dripping water and shifting skin. Then it blinked and was only her again. Outside, the lake sighed. Inside, the frog whispered, "Sleep." And she did. But the archivists note that in every draft recovered, the princess's face that night, though peaceful, was not entirely her own. The palace did not announce its unraveling. It simply shifted, quietly, inevitably, as though responding not to an intruding curse, but to a long-awaited command woven into its foundations. The princess felt it first in the trembling of her reflection, that faint quiver at the edge of silvered surfaces where her outline no longer held absolute loyalty to her shape. When she lifted her hand, the reflection sometimes lagged. When she turned her head, the mirrored version of her eyes flicked toward the frog before she did. The archivists call this skin drift, a precursor to identity bleed, often observed in records where a subject exists in multiple conflicting states. The princess, unaware of terminology but painfully aware of sensation, began to feel as though she trailed behind herself by half a breath. The frog remained always at her side, its presence a quiet weight in the air. It watched her with an attentiveness that was too sharp, too knowing, yet somehow gentle, like someone remembering a story they had lived before. When she asked again what it meant by another draft, another telling, the creature only replied, "You know." But she didn't know, not fully, and the ache of that unknowing pressed behind her eyes like a bruise. The palace servants, unsettled by her drifting focus and the strange creature accompanying her, kept their distance. They whispered of layered shadows beneath the princess's footsteps, as though she walked not alone but with echoes of herself only a heartbeat behind. Some claimed they heard additional footfalls when she passed, though no one walked beside her but the frog. Others swore the frog's shape changed subtly throughout the day, its skin turning from smooth to scaled to patterned with faint sigils, like the roots of the thorned rose vines recorded in the Garden of Thorns, though when interrogated they admitted the sigils could have been shadows, or imagination, or the twisting of lamplight through restless curtains. The archivists mark these reports as credible symptoms of a shifting form entity, though they note that the princess herself occasionally exhibited similar fluctuations. On the 7th day after the bargain, she woke to find the air in her chambers thick and warm, infused with a damp earthiness, like fresh soil overturned. The frog sat upon her windowsill, its gaze fixed toward the lake. Sunrise glimmered across the water, but the reflections behaved strangely, pulling at the light, twisting it, holding it too long as though reluctant to release it. "You feel it," the frog said. Not a question. The princess pressed a palm to her sternum. Beneath her skin, something pulsed in a rhythm that did not belong to her heart, a second, softer beat that occasionally slipped out of sync. She whispered, "What is happening to me?" The frog turned, its eyes ancient and sorrowful. "You are remembering." "Remembering what?" There was a long silence. "The original you," the frog said, and the words dripped into her like ink sinking through parchment, staining layers she had not realized were there. The princess stepped back. Her breath shuddered. "You speak in riddles. Stop it. Tell me plainly." The frog hopped down from the sill, moving toward her in slow, deliberate motions. Each hop seemed slightly too heavy, as though the creature carried more mass than its shape suggested. "Once," it said, "you were mine." The princess froze. "I was no one's." "Not owned," the frog corrected. "Bound by choice." The walls seemed to lean closer. The embroidered patterns on the tapestries curled faintly inward, forming shapes that might have been eyes watching. The princess shook her head. "I made no such choice." "Not in this telling," the frog whispered, "but in others." The princess backed away until her shoulders brushed the cold stone of the wall. "I don't understand." "Not yet," the frog murmured, "but you will." Over the following days, the palace continued to shift as though adjusting itself to a truth returning from beneath its foundations. Hallways elongated by a step or two, doorways narrowed or broadened depending on the princess's mood. Light pooled in corners where no lanterns burned, shimmering with faint slipper-shaped glints reminiscent of the 13th slipper. The princess tried to ignore them, but the archive notes that the anomalies increased correlated to her emotional state. Meanwhile, the lake grew restless. Its surface rippled without wind, forming circular patterns that resembled the pupil of an enormous eye. Sometimes the water darkened abruptly, then cleared again, leaving behind a faint hum that vibrated through the palace stones. Something waited beneath it, something old, patient, and tied to the princess with threads neither entirely visible nor fully severed. One evening, unable to bear the claustrophobic pressure of her chambers, the princess fled to the outer terraces. The frog followed without a word. The moon hung low above the lake, its reflection fractured into many shifting forms. Some looked like the princess's face, others did not. She stood at the balustrade and whispered, "What did I lose, truly?" The frog sat beside her, its skin rippling with unreadable patterns. "A piece of yourself," it said, "the part that remembers me." The princess swallowed hard. "And you retrieved it?" The frog nodded. "At a price." "My promise," she murmured, "for you to stay by my side." "Yes." "And when my heart is whole?" The frog's throat pulsed as though it swallowed something difficult. "Then I return to the depths." She looked out at the lake, watching the reflections drift in disobedient ways. "And if I don't want my heart to be whole?" The frog turned toward her sharply. "Princess, if I keep the missing part lost," she continued, "you will not leave." The frog said nothing. Its silence pressed against her skin like a cold hand. "This bond," she whispered, "was it ever fair?" The frog lowered its head. "Fairness is not part of our tale." The princess felt something tighten in her chest. She closed her eyes. Images flickered behind her eyelids, fragments of memory that felt both hers and not hers. A hand reaching toward a darkened lake, a voice whispering promises beneath the water, skin shedding like fabric, a crown sinking, a face shifting, layered, uncertain. She gasped and stepped back from the railing. The frog hopped closer. "It is returning," it murmured. "Your truth. I don't want it, but it wants you." Over the next nights, the princess's dreams worsened. She walked through an endless forest of whispering trees, branches bending toward her like skeletal arms. Leaves murmured warnings in voices from earlier records. Belle, the 13th princess, the lost princes of the Weeping Wood, though their words blurred into indistinct syllables. Thorns crawled along her skin in spirals, dissolving before piercing. She saw a figure in the distance, tall, dripping, layered with shifting skins, and each time she approached, the form mirrored hers exactly before melting into the lake's reflection. She began awakening with her breath caught in her throat and the frog sitting silently near her pillow, watching as though guarding her from something or ensuring she did not escape it. Then came the night when she found the note. It lay on her bedside table, written in a handwriting she recognized yet could not place. The ink smudged as though resisting permanence. The archivists later determined it matched no living hand and may have been a self-generated artifact of the record attempting to stabilize its fractured narrative. It read, "Do not trust the water. Do not trust the reflection. Do not trust the prince." The princess stared at it for a long time. Her hands trembled. "Prince?" she whispered aloud. The frog, startled from sleep, lifted its head. "What did you say?" She held up the note. "This. What does this mean?" The frog stared at the paper with a look that could only be described as fear. "Where did you find that?" "Here. When I woke." The frog leapt away from it, retreating into a shadowed corner. "It is beginning," it whispered. "The drafts are bleeding." "What drafts?" the princess cried. The frog shuddered, its form flickering at the edges as though the boundaries of its shape struggled to hold. "There are many versions of us," it said. "In some, you cursed me. In others, I cursed you. In yet others, we shared a fate that broke the telling." "Broke it how?" The frog shook its head. "The archive sealed most of those. The endings were not stable." The princess felt cold all over. "And which version is this?" The frog stared at her, its shifting eyes wide with something like desperation. "I don't know." The princess pressed a hand to her chest again. The second heartbeat pulsed stronger now, almost painful. "Then what am I becoming?" she whispered. The frog approached her slowly, cautiously, as though nearing a frightened child or a dangerous creature. "You are becoming what you were," it said. "Unless you choose otherwise." "Choose?" she echoed. "How can I choose when I don't know the truth?" The frog hesitated, then rose onto its hind legs. a motion too smooth, too human, and placed its hand on her wrist again. "You know more than you think," it murmured. "Look." And suddenly she did look, into the window's reflection, where her face stared back at her with eyes that were not her own. Behind her mirrored self stood a tall figure made of shifting skins, its shape flowing like water caught between forms. It reached toward her reflection, and the reflection smiled. She staggered back, heart hammering twice over. The frog caught her arm. "You must remember," it whispered, "before the lake claims you again." "Claims me?" she cried. "What am I to the lake?" The frog's voice trembled. "Its bride, its queen, its forgotten daughter, its curse, its origin, its prisoner. In different drafts you were all of these." The princess felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Identity bleed surged through her like a wave. The frog tightened its grip. "I brought back the piece you lost," it murmured. "But the rest is still waiting in the depths." The princess pulled her hand away sharply. "Then I never should have made that bargain." The frog's eyes dimmed. "Perhaps not." "Undo it," she demanded. "Break the promise." "I cannot break a promise freely given." "Then I release you." The frog flinched. "You release me?" "Yes." The creature trembled. "If you release me," it whispered, "there will be consequences. The lake will reclaim what was lost, and you will face what waits beneath." "I don't care," the princess said. "I cannot bear this unraveling." The frog's voice cracked. "Princess, please." But she stepped back, standing tall despite the fear trembling through her body. "I release you," she repeated. The frog bowed its head, as though the words struck like a physical blow. "Then the lake will answer," it whispered. Behind them, the water stirred, forming a spiral that glowed faintly with shifting shapes, crowns, faces, skins, memories. The princess watched in horror as the spiral widened. The frog stepped toward the terrace edge. "Goodbye," it said softly. Or perhaps, hello, depending on the telling. Then it leapt toward the lake. Its form stretched midair, unraveling into strands of shimmering skin that dissolved before touching the water. The lake swallowed the last piece of it without a ripple, and the princess felt something inside her tear open. The tearing was soundless yet absolute, a rift not across flesh but across self, as though the frog's departure unstitched the seams holding the princess together. She staggered backward, clutching her chest as the second heartbeat thundered in frantic uneven bursts, then merged abruptly with her own until she could no longer tell which throb belonged to which part of her. The lake below churned in slow spirals, the water thickening with shadows that coiled like living ink. Reflections fractured across its surface, forming countless versions of the princess, some screaming, some smiling with silent, eerie serenity, some wearing crowns of dripping water, some shifting between shapes faster than sight could follow. Her breath hitched as the terrace stones beneath her feet quivered, responding to her rising panic. The palace itself seemed uncertain of how to hold her shape now that the frog, her anchor, her tether, her contradiction, had vanished. Walls narrowed, the sky stretched, lantern flames bent toward her as if drawn to her unraveling identity. She pressed her hands over her eyes, but the images continued behind her lids. The frog dissolving midair, skins peeling into light, a dark depth calling to her, a version of herself underwater, waiting, watching. The archivist note in the margin of this section, written in a shaking, near illegible hand, that it is unclear whether the princess's visions were hallucinations, recovered memories from alternate drafts, or glimpses into the lake's ancient consciousness. Identity bleed at this stage, they caution, is often irreversible. The princess, however, could think only of the sudden emptiness beside her, the absence of the quiet presence that had shadowed her for days. Tears blurred her vision. "Why did you leave?" she whispered to the lake. The water responded by rising in a thin, trembling column, as if a hand made of liquid were reaching toward her. She stumbled back, horrified. The column shattered into droplets, each droplet containing a tiny reflection of her face. Some human, some scaled, some crowned, some shifting. She realized then that she had not merely lost the frog. She had broken the delicate equilibrium that prevented the lake from reclaiming her, and now it stretched toward her with yearning, hunger, or recognition. She could not tell which. "No," she breathed. No, I won't be taken. But the lake was already changing. Its surface drew in the moonlight and twisted it into forms. A tall figure rose from the depths, made entirely of reflections, hundreds of overlapping images of her own face, each slightly wrong. Its shape rippled between masculine and feminine, royal and monstrous, smooth-skinned and layered with shifting textures like the frog's ever-altering hide. The princess stumbled backward and collided with the terrace wall. She pressed herself against the stone as though hoping the palace might protect her. But the palace, too, seemed uncertain now. Tapestries curled away from her touch, shadows lengthened beneath her feet. Somewhere deep within the halls, a seam split with a soft sigh, as though the structure itself exhaled in relief or resignation. The figure stepped onto the terrace, water pooling beneath its impossible feet. When it spoke, its voice was layered with many tones, some hers, some others, some belonging to the frog as it had sounded in her dreams, some belonging to voices she did not recognize but somehow remembered. "Daughter of the depths," it whispered, "bride of reflection, lost queen." "I am none of these," she said, though her voice trembled and her skin rippled faintly in response to the names as if recognizing them. The figure tilted its head. "Then tell me what you are." She opened her mouth, but no answer came. Her identity trembled like a candle flame in a draught. The figure reached out a hand made of liquid mirrors, fingers formed of overlapping reflections. "Come home," it murmured. "You do not belong in this telling." The princess backed along the terrace wall, heart pounding. "I will not go with you." A ripple of disappointment passed across the entity's many faces. "You cannot exist apart from us," it whispered. "It was the frog who bound you into this shape. It was the frog who gave you edges, limits, a form to inhabit. Without him, you will dissolve." "I won't," she said, but her voice cracked. The second heartbeat inside her faltered, then surged violently. Her skin shimmered, shifting briefly into something scaly, then smooth, then feathered, then human again. She cried out and clutched her arms tightly. "Stop," she gasped. "Stop changing." The figure stepped closer. "You are remembering too quickly," it said. "Your selves are merging. You cannot hold them all." "I don't want them," she whispered desperately. "I want my life, my real life." The figure paused, as though puzzled. "The life you believe is yours is only one draft among many. A soft one, a shallow one, a version shaped by fear of what you truly are." "I am human," she insisted. "I am a princess of—" But even as she said it, her kingdom's name slipped from her tongue before she could form it. Letters unraveled, words dissolved. The figure's expression softened with something almost like pity. "You cannot return to a name that no longer remembers you." She felt the truth strike deep. Her knees buckled. The stone beneath her pulsed faintly, absorbing her despair as though drinking it. The lake entity extended its hand again, more gently this time. "You will be safe below," it whispered. "Whole again. You will not have to choose between skins." She wanted to scream, but instead she whispered, "What happened to the frog?" The figure's composition flickered violently. Dozens of reflections blinked out and reappeared. Some turned away, some wept, some grimaced in anger. "The frog," the entity said slowly, "was the part of you that refused the lake, the part that split away to walk on land, the part that chose form over fluidity, the part that remembered how to be singular." The princess's breath left her in a shudder. "He was... me?" "He was your defiance given shape." "Then why did he," her voice broke, "why did he ask to stay with me?" The entity tilted its many heads. "Because he loved the shape you had chosen, and because he wished to warn you, but he could not." "Why not?" "Because promises bind, even across drafts." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of deep water. The princess closed her eyes, overwhelmed by grief she could not entirely understand. "If he was part of me," she whispered, "then where is he now?" The entity looked toward the lake. "Returned," it said. "Dissolved, awaiting your decision." Something inside her cracked open, flooding her with unbearable loss. "He didn't want to leave," she whispered. "No," the entity said softly. "But you released him." She felt her legs give way. The entity caught her before she hit the ground, its reflective hands cool but oddly gentle. "Come," it murmured. Let us finish the unmaking." "No," she whispered weakly. The entity hesitated. "You refuse dissolution?" It sounded almost surprised. "I refuse the lake," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I refuse all versions that demand my surrender." The entity's form rippled with agitation. "Without the lake, there is no you." "Then I will make a new me." The words burst from her like a spark in the dark. The entity recoiled, as though burned. "You do not understand the magnitude of that choice," it warned. "A self forged outside the lake cannot be rewritten. You will become fixed, permanent." "Good," the princess said. "I choose solidity." The water across the lake spasmed violently, reflections writhing in disarray. "If you bind yourself to one skin," the entity said, "you sever all others. You condemn countless drafts to oblivion." "Then let them go," she whispered. The entity stared at her for a long moment. Its shape quivered, thinning around the edges as though strained. "Very well," it said. Its voice splintered into countless tones. "If you will not return to us, then you must reclaim what the frog carried." It touched her chest lightly. A shock ran through her, and from the lake rose a small orb of shimmering liquid light. It floated toward her, trailing reflections of the frog's many shapes, amphibious, human, in between. The orb hovered before her heart. "This is the last piece of you that resisted the lake," the entity said. "If you take it back, you complete yourself. And if I don't, you dissolve within the hour." Her hands shook as she reached toward the orb. It pulsed once, like a tiny heartbeat, echoing her own. Tears blurred her vision. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the memory of the frog. "I'm so sorry." She pressed the orb to her chest. Light sank into her skin. Her body arched as the second heartbeat roared back to life, not as something foreign, but as something wholly hers. The lake screamed, not in sound, but in the violent shudder of water and reflection as the entity staggered backward, its shape collapsing. The princess stood, gasping, her form stabilizing for the first time. Her reflection in the terrace window matched her exactly. Singular, solid, hers. "It is done," she said. The entity writhed, losing coherence. "You have broken the cycle," it whispered. "You have fixed your shape." "Yes." "Then the lake no longer knows you." Its voice dissolved into ripples. Its form collapsed into a wave that splashed onto the terrace before draining back into the water. The lake stilled. The reflection of the princess stared up at her from its surface, human, unwavering. She whispered, "Goodbye." And for the first time, there were no echoes, no shifting skins, no alternate drafts, only one self, one fate, one heartbeat. She turned away from the lake and walked back into the palace, her steps steady, her shadow whole. Behind her, the archive recorded the moment the record stabilized. Its pages no longer shimmered, its margins no longer bled, and its ink no longer shifted. The princess had chosen singularity over endlessness, and the lake, faced with a self it could not rewrite, fell silent at last.
Thank you for joining us in the world of Twilight Fables. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more.